It was a curious scene when the momentous interview which was to determine our fate and that of Mars began. Aina had been warned of what was coming. We in the flagship had all learned to speak her language with more or less ease, but it was deemed best that the Heidelberg professor, assisted by one of his colleagues, should act as interpreter. The girl, flushed with excitement of the novel situation, fully appreciating the importance of what was about to occur, and looking more charming than before, stood at one side of the principal apartment. Directly facing her were the interpreters, and the rest of us, all with ears intent and eyes focused upon Aina, stood in a double row behind them. As heretofore, I am setting down her words translated into our own tongue, having taken only so much liberty as to connect the sentences into a stricter sequence than they had when falling from her lips in reply to the questions that were showered upon her. She has a plan. You will never be victorious, she said, if you attack them openly as you have been doing. They are too strong and too numerous. They are well prepared for such attacks, because they have had to resist them before. Aina's plan to capture Mars. Aina's plan. Our beautiful captive tells us that it will be impossible for us to subdue the Martians in a hand-to-hand conflict, but reveals a plan to exterminate them which is gigantic in its scope and originality. They have waged war with the inhabitants of the asteroid Ceres, whose people are giants greater than themselves. Their enemies from Ceres have attacked them here. Hence these fortifications, with weapons pointing skyward, and the great air fleets which you have encountered. But there must be some point, said Mr. Edison, where we can. Yes, interrupted the girl quickly, there is one blow you can deal them which they could not withstand. What is that? Eagerly inquired the commander. You can drown them out. How? With the canals? We must drown them out. Yes, I will explain to you. I have already told you, and, in fact, you must have seen it for yourselves, that there are almost no mountains on Mars. A very learned man of my race used to say that the reason was because Mars is so very old a world that the mountains at once had been almost completely leveled, and the entire surface of the planet had become a great plain. There are depressions, however, most of which are occupied by the seas. The greater part of the land lies below the level of the oceans. In order at the same time to irrigate the soil and make it fruitful, and to protect themselves from overflows by the ocean breaking in upon them, the Martians have constructed the immense and innumerable canals which you see running in all directions over the continents. There is one period in the year, and that period has now arrived, when there is special danger of a great deluge. Most of the oceans of Mars lie in the southern hemisphere. When it is summer in that hemisphere, the great masses of ice and snow collected around the South Pole melt rapidly away. Yes, that is so, broke in one of our astronomers, who was listening attentively. Many a time I have seen the vast snowfields around the southern pole of Mars completely disappear as the summer sun rose high upon them. With the melting of these snows, continued Aina, a rapid rise in the level of the water in the southern oceans occurs. On the side facing these oceans, the continents of Mars are sufficiently elevated to prevent an overflow, but nearer the equator the level of the land sinks lower. With your telescopes you have no doubt noticed that there is a great bending sea connecting the oceans of the south with those of the north and running through the midst of the continents. Quite so, said the astronomer who had spoken before, we call it the Syrtis Major. That long narrow sea, Aina went on, forms a great channel through which the flood of waters caused by the melting of the southern polar snows flows swiftly toward the equator and then on toward the north until it reaches the sea basins which exist there. At that point it is rapidly turned into ice and snow, because, of course, while it is summer in the southern hemisphere it is winter in the northern. Mars will be ours. The Serviss Major, I am giving our name to the channel of communication in place of that by which the girl called it, is like a great safety valve, which, by permitting the waters to flow northward, saves the continents from inundation. But when midsummer arrives, the snows around the pole having been completely melted away, the flood ceases and the water begins to recede. At this time, but for a device which the Martians have employed, the canals connected with the oceans would run dry, and the vegetation, left without moisture under the summer sun, would quickly perish. To prevent this, they have built a series of enormous gates extending completely across the Serviss Major at its narrowest point, latitude 25 degrees south. These gates are all controlled by machinery collected at a single point on the shore of the strait. As soon as the flood in the Serviss Major begins to recede, the gates are closed, and, the water being thus restrained, the irrigating canals are kept full long enough to mature the harvests. The clue! The clue at last, exclaimed Mr. Edison. That is the place where we shall nip them. If we can close those gates now at the moment of high tide, we shall flood the country. Did you say, he continued, turning to Ana, that the movement of the gates was all controlled from a single point? The great powerhouse. Yes, said the girl. There is a great building, powerhouse, full of tremendous machinery which I once entered when my father was taken there by his master, and where I saw one Martian, by turning a little handle, caused the great line of gates, stretching 100 miles across the sea, to slowly shut in, edge to edge, until the flow of the water toward the north had been stopped. How is the building protected? So completely, replied Ana, that my only fear is that you may not be able to reach it. On account of the danger from their enemies on Ceres, the Martians have fortified it strongly on all sides, and have even surrounded it and covered it overhead with a great electrical network, to touch which would be instant death. Ah, said Mr. Edison, they have got an electric shield, have they? Well, I think we shall be able to manage that. Anyhow, he continued, we have got to get into that powerhouse, and we have got to close those gates, and we must not lose much time in making up our minds how it is to be done. Evidently this is our only chance. We have not force enough to contend in open battle with the Martians, but if we can flood them out, and thereby render the engines contained in their fortifications useless, perhaps we shall be able to deal with the airships, which will be all the means of defense that will then remain to them. This idea commended itself to all the leaders of the expedition. It was determined to make a reconnaissance at once. But it would not do for us to approach the planet too hastily, and we certainly could not think of landing upon it in broad daylight. Still, as long as we were yet at a considerable distance from Mars, we felt that we should be safe from observation, because so much time had elapsed while we were hidden behind Deimos that the Martians had undoubtedly concluded that we were no longer in existence. So we boldly quitted the little satellite with our entire squadron and once more rapidly approached the red planet of war. This time it was to be a death grapple, and our chances of victory still seemed good. Ready for a death grapple. As soon as we arrived so near the planet that there was danger of our being actually seen, we took pains to keep continually in the shadow of Mars, and the more surely to conceal our presence all lights upon the ships were extinguished. The precaution of the commander even went so far as to have the smooth metallic sides of the cars blackened over so that they should not reflect light, and thus become visible to the Martians as shining specks, moving suspiciously among the stars. The precise location of the great powerhouse on the shores of the Serviss Major having been carefully ascertained, the squadron dropped down one night into the upper limits of the Martian atmosphere, directly over the Gulf. Then a consultation was called on the flagship and a plan of campaign was quickly devised. It was deemed wise that the attempt should be made with a single electrical ship, but that the others should be kept hovering near, ready to respond on the instant to any signal for aid which might come from below. It was thought that, notwithstanding the wonderful defenses, which, according to Ana's account, surrounded the building, a small party would have a better chance of success than a large one. Mr. Edison was certain that the electrical network which was described as covering the powerhouse would not prove a serious obstruction to us, because by carefully sweeping the space where we intended to pass with the disintegrators before quitting the ship, the netting could be sufficiently cleared away to give us uninterrupted passage. At first the intention was to have 20 men, each armed with 2 disintegrators, that being the largest number that one person could carry to advantage, descend from the electrical ship and make the venture. But, after further discussion, this number was reduced, first to a dozen, and finally, to only 4. These 4 consisted of Mr. Edison, Colonel Smith, Mr. Sidney Phillips and myself. Both by her own request and because we could not help feeling that her knowledge of the locality would be indispensable to us, Ana was also included in our party, but not, of course, as a fighting member of it. It was about an hour after midnight when the ship in which we were to make the venture parted from the remainder of the squadron and dropped cautiously down. The blaze of electric lights running away in various directions indicated the lines of innumerable canals with habitations crowded along their banks, which came to a focus at a point on the continent of Aria, westward from the Syrtis Major. Destroying the Martians. With Ana's aid, our warriors prepare an awful revenge on the enemy.